Welcome to the Stories of Christmas podcast. My name is MyLinda Butterworth, and I will be your teller of tales during this festive season. Today, we follow Gaspard, Melchior, and Balthazar, the Magi, as they search not for the newborn child, for they had already done that, but for Christ, in the Magi in the West and their search for the Christ, a tale for the Christmas tide by Frederick E. Dewhurst. Now, it happened a long time ago in the year, not that the exact year does not matter, because you will not find this story written in the history of any of the nations of the world. But in one of the countries of Europe bordering on the Mediterranean Sea was a lofty mountain, which to the dwellers in the plains below seemed to reach to the very sky. At times its summit was covered with clouds, so that it could not be seen. At other times it stood out fair and clear, as though silently asking the people to look up and not down. The lower slopes of the mountain were covered with olive trees, with groves of oranges and lemons, and with vineyards, and they were dotted here and there with little white cottages of the peasants who had made their living from those groves and vineyards, and the fruit of which they sold in the city not far away. Along the mountainside wound a foot trail, even to the summit, and nowhere in all the region was there a finer view of the Mediterranean than from the summit of this mountain. In the long summer afternoons, the peasants and children would climb to the top and look off to the lovely picture of land and sea. Then they would eat their simple lunch of bread and dates and olives and quench their thirst from the spring on the mountainside, which they called the dew of heaven. So clear and fresh and sparkling was it, and when the sun began to touch the western sky with its pencils of gold and carmine and purple, they hastened down that they might reach their cottages before the night shut in. On the day when the story begins, a man was standing on the summit of the mountain, looking across the sea in the direction where you would find Tyre and Joppa on the map. He was very plainly not one of the peasants who lived on the mountainside. He looked about 60 years of age. He was tall and erect, though he carried a staff in his hand. His hair and beard were long and flowing and almost gray, but his eyes were clear and penetrating, and he was looking across the sea as though he expected someone to appear. And while he stood there gazing seaward, there appeared a second man on the summit, helping himself up with his staff and panting with the effort of the long climb. From his dress and manner, it was plain that this man, too, was not one of the peasants, for, like the first comer, he seemed to belong to another age and clime. The two men glanced at each other and gave such greeting as strangers might, who should meet in so solitary a spot as a mountain summit. Then both lapsed into silence and looked off across the sea. Presently the last comer seemed to awake from his reverie. He walked over to the place where the other man was sitting, still gazing off towards Joppa, and touched him on the shoulder. "1,000 pardons, my friend," he said, "but my mind is haunted with some far-off recognition, as though in some other land and some far-off time I had seen thy face. Wilt thou have the kindness to tell me thy name?" Without lifting his eyes from the sea, and in a tone which seemed regretful and sad, the stranger replied, "My name is Gaspard." "Gaspard! Indeed, then, have I seen thee. Look at me, my friend. Dost thou not remember me? My name is Melchior. Dost thou not recall that time, how long I know not, when thou and I and Balthazar followed a star, which led us to a little Jewish hamlet, thou bearing gold, I frankincense, and Balthazar myrrh? Dost thou not remember how, on the long journey thither, we talked about the young prince, whom we expected to find in a royal palace, and how at last, when we reached the village following the star, we were led not to a palace, but to a little inn, and not only to a room within the inn, but to the stable yard, where we found a sweet-faced woman bending over a babe cradled in a manger, and standing near, a sturdy peasant, proud and happy, whose name was Joseph. Dost thou not remember, too, that when we had recovered from our surprise, we left our gifts and greetings and went out the way as men who had been dreaming? Gaspard, dost thou not remember? And Gaspard, looking now intently at the other's face, replied, Yes, Melchior, I remember thee. I remember the journey of which thou hast spoken better than I remember aught else. Nothing have I forgotten the surprise and disappointment with which we came to the place whither the star led us, nor how after leaving our gifts we went away as in a dream. And Melchior, I have been dreaming ever since. Even here hast thou found me in a dream of perplexity. I am still Gaspard, the wandering magician. For how many years I know not. I have wandered up and down these lands of Europe. I have crossed the seas, and every place I have sought to find the kingdom over which we were told the young prince would one day reign. Dost thou not remember that we were told his kingdom was to last forever, that he would reign in it himself forever and would never die? Alas, I have lost the power of the magician's art. I can summon no star to guide me to the place where I shall find this kingdom and its king. Truly, Gaspard, answered Melchior, the story of your wandering is but the repetition of my own, and even now I was drawn to this mountain summit on the self-same errand that brought you here, to see if I could not discover in the direction of yonder land where Bethlehem was some star which might prove to be his star and which might guide me in the new quest. If only our old companion Balthazar were with us now, he might give us the clue to our search, for not only he was more skillful in the magician's art, but he was braver and more courageous, and withal more serene in spirit. Now, even when Melchior was speaking, a voice was heard way down in the mountain. Gaspard and Melchior stopped to listen. The voice was singing, and the words of the song floated up to them distinctly. If the sun has hid its light, if the day has turned to night, if the heavens are not benign, it's the stars refuse to shine. Heart of man, lose not thy hope. Door there's none that shall not ope. Path there's none that shall not clear. Heart of man, why shouldst thou fear? If for years should be thy quest, if for years thou hast no rest, if thou circlest earth and sea, if thou worn and weary be, Heart of man, lose not thy hope. Door there's none that shall not ope. Path there's none that shall not clear. Heart of man, why shouldst thou fear? That, exclaimed Gaspard and Melchior together, is the voice of Balthazar. And they hastened to meet him, for he was now almost at the summit, and the refrain of his song was still upon his lips. At that moment, Balthazar sprang up from the sloping path into full view of the two men, and giving each a hand, exclaimed, "Gaspard, Melchior, beloved companions, I have found you at last." The peasants below were not mistaken. From their descriptions, I was certain I should find you here, and you too have been searching these long years for the kingdom of the Christ. And like me, you have met with disappointment. But comrades, be not of faint heart. Door there's none that shall not ope. Path there's none that shall not clear. Let us hasten down the mountain, for see, the sky is already growing gold and crimson beyond the pillars of Hercules. Let us seek the wayfarer's lodging with hospitable peasants in the valley, and tomorrow let us begin our search for the Christ anew. We have wandered alone. Let us invoke now the star to guide us together. That night, therefore, the three strangers lodged with the simple peasant folk in the valley, partaking with thankfulness of the coarse bread, the dates, and the red wine, the common fare of their daily life. Nor did they fail to notice a motto inscribed about the fireplace in rude Greek letters. On the morrow they were ready to begin their search together for the Christ, and they hoped not to wander far before they should find at last the outskirts of his kingdom. But whither should they go? In what direction should they first turn their steps? While they were thus wondering and debating, Balthazar suddenly exclaimed, "I see the star!" And behold, a little way before them, and at no great distance above their heads, there discerned in the gray of the early morning a star of pale opal light, which seemed to move forward as the men moved toward it. "We must follow the star," Balthazar said in a whisper, silently and breathlessly. His companions followed him. Now, so intently did the three men keep their eyes fixed upon the star, and so eagerly did they follow in the direction where it seemed to lead, that it was only after a considerable time they discovered that they had become separated from each other, and that their paths were getting farther and farther apart. Yet, there before each of them was the star, shining with its soft opalescent light, and still ringing in their ears were the words of Balthazar, "We must follow the star." So each followed the star, each by himself alone. Gaspard's path wound round the shore of the gulfs and bays of the Mediterranean, till at last the star turned southward and drew him nearer and nearer a great city, and finally stood still over the dome of a vast cathedral. "It must be," thought Gaspard, "that I have come to the end of my search. This must be the capital and palace of the eternal king." The square in front of the cathedral was thronged with people. Multitudes were pouring in through the great portals. Gaspard joined the throngs and at last found himself under the mighty dome, which seemed to him as far away as the sky itself. Everything in this wonderful place appealed to his imagination. There were great rows of massive columns, symbol of a strength eternal, and they seemed like the wide open arms holding out a welcome to the human race. There were statues and paintings by great masters in art. The light of the sun poured in through many-colored windows on which were blazoned the deeds of heroes and saints. Strains of music from great organ in the distance floated out upon the air. Touched and thrilled by all he saw, Gaspard exclaimed to himself, "The place on which I stand is holy ground." Soon, however, he perceived that the throngs of people were not lingering, like himself, in awe and wonder over the great columns and the dome and the statues and the paintings and the windows. Their eyes were fixed intently upon something that was going on in the far end of the cathedral. An altar was there, and priests in white robes passing up and down before it, and tall tapers burning around it. Near the altar was the image of a man hanging from a cross. His hands and feet were pierced with nails, and a cruel wound was in his side. The people were gazing at this altar and at the image and at what the white-robed priests were doing. The strains of solemn music were the organ blending with the voices of the priests, chanting the service. Clouds of incense rose from censers swung from solid motion by the altar boys, and the fragrance of the incense was wafted down the long aisles. At last, the tinkling of a bell. The organ became silent for an instant, as though it felt within its heart the awful solemnity of the moment. And then it burst forth into new rapture, and the people began pouring out through the great doors. Gaspard went forth with the throng into the cathedral square of And this, he said, is the end of my search. I have found the Christ. His kingdom is in the imagination of man. How beautiful, how wonderful, how strange it was. Dominus vobiscum, did not the priest say? Here, then, at last I found the city of the great king. But as he lingered, behold, the star which had stood over the dome of the cathedral was now before him, as at the first, and it seemed to waver and tremble as if beckoning him on. So although his feet seemed bound to the spot, and his heart was still throbbing with the deep feeling the cathedral service had created in him, remembering the words of Balthazar, "We must follow the star," he slowly and reluctantly walked on. In the meantime, Melchior also had followed faithfully the path along which the star seemed to lead. Through forests in which he almost lost his way, across rivers difficult and dangerous to ford. Still he followed on. At length Melchior's star seemed to tarry over the spire of a Gothic church, into which the people were going in throngs. Waiting a moment to be sure that the star was actually standing still, Melchior went in with the rest. In this place was no altar such as Gaspard saw, no image on the cross, no white-robed priests, no swinging censers, but as Melchior entered, he heard strains from the organ, and a chorus of voices was singing an anthem beginning with the words, "Tu te dum lotmas." And when the anthem came to a close, a man clothed in a black robe such as scholars were wont to wear, rose in his place upon the platform elevated above the people, and began to speak to them about the kingdom of Christ. Melchior listened to the eager expectancy. "The truth shall make you free. The kingdom of the Christ," the preacher said, "is the kingdom of the truth, and the truth is to be continued and kept alive by the strength of man's belief. Those things which have been handed down by holy men and sacred oils since Christ was here upon the earth are the truths by which we live. How can Christ live except he live in our beliefs? Why did the Father of all entrust us with our reasons, unless it were that we should make them the instruments of our faith and our salvation? Let us therefore stand in our places while we recite together the articles of our holy faith. These and many such words did the scholar preacher declare. And as he sat there with the people, Melchior felt the weight of the solemn and earnest words, and he said, So, at last have I come to the end of my search. The kingdom of Christ is in the mind of men. His kingdom is the kingdom of truth. Then he followed the throngs as they went forth from the church. But the star, which had tarried over the lofty spire, was now before him, and the opal light wavered and trembled, as if beckoning him on, and the words of the preacher, "We must believe," seemed to blend with the words of Balthazar, "We must follow the star." So reluctantly and slowly he followed on. But Balthazar, whither he went, following the star, over many a rugged way, through many a tangled thicket, through valleys and over hills. His star tarried over no cathedrals. He lingered over no Gothic spires. It seems capricious and restless and tireless. At times it seemed intent on coming to a pause over the head of some human being. But perhaps it was because these human beings themselves were so restless and so busy that the star could not accomplish its intent. For Balthazar saw these men and women hurrying hither and thither on errands of mercy or deeds of justice. He saw them ferreting out great wrongs, laying heavy blows on the backs of men who were oppressed and defrauded their fellow men. At length, Balthazar seemed to understand the movements of the star, and drawing near he would seem to hear these men repeating cheering and encouraging words to one another. "Pure religion and undefiled," he heard one exclaiming, "is to visit the fatherless and widows in their afflictions, and to keep himself unspotted from the world." And another echoed, "Inasmuch as we do it to the least of these, we do it unto Christ." "Ah," thought Balthazar, as he listened, "I see the meaning of it now. I am coming to the end of my search. The kingdom of Christ, I have found it. It is in the deeds of men. It is in the conscience and the serving will, devotion to the right. This is the law of the kingdom of Christ." Then Balthazar turned to go in search of his comrades again. But behold, the opal star was trembling, as if beckoning him on. So still doubting if he would reach the end of his search, he followed the star. Thus, Gaspard, Melchior, and Balthazar, each following the star, at last approached each other. The star of each seemed to melt and blend into the star of the other, and the opal light stood at last in the center of the group. Gaspard exclaimed, "I have found that which us all were seeking. The kingdom of Christ is in the imagination. Christ lives in what man feels." "Nay," said Melchior, "I have followed the star, and I have found what we sought. The kingdom of Christ is in the reason of man. Christ lives in what man believes." "But," cried Balthazar, "my star has led me to a different end. The kingdom of Christ is in the will of man. Christ lives in what man does." "The truth," once more exclaimed Melchior, "is the law of the kingdom." "Not truth," declared Balthazar, "but justice, righteousness, goodness, and purity. These are its laws and its marks." "Nay, comrades beloved, hearken to me," answered Gaspard. "It is the miracle of the divine presence. It is God among men, realized in the Holy Mass. I beheld it all in yonder cathedral. But lo, once more the star began to tremble and to change its place. Let us follow the star, Balthazar whispered. We will follow it, echoed the other two. Then the star led them on, and they followed together until they came at length to the doorway of a little cottage. And within the cottage they saw a woman bending over a cradle, and in the cradle a little child lay asleep. She was a peasant woman. Her clothing were not rich. The furnishings of the cottage was humble and scanty. The cradle itself rude, as if put together by hands unskillful in tasks like that. But when the mother looked at her babe, a sweet smile played across her lips, and a light was in her eyes. Then all of a sudden the three men remembered another scene long before, when they were bearers of gold and frankincense and myrrh to another babe. And while they stood and wondered by the door, there came a strong and sturdy peasant, broad-shouldered, roughly clad, his face browned in the sun, his hands hardened with toil. He came and stood beside the woman, and they bent together over the cradle of the sleeping child. And the man drew the woman tenderly toward him and kissed her brow. And still the three men lingered. For behold, the star stood still above the child, and they dared not speak. But the heart of Gaspard was saying in silence, there is something greater than the repeated miracle of the Mass. And Melchior was thinking, there is something mightier even than the mind, something superior in naked truth. And Balthazar was confessing to himself that he had found something more potent even than the righteous deed. For here they all beheld how life was made sweet and blessed and holy by the power of love, and by love for a little child in whom was all weakness and helplessness, whose only voice was a cry, but who was all strong and mighty with the power of God, because he could transform roughness into tenderness, and selfishness into loving care, and poverty itself into gifts of gold, frankincense, and fragrant myrrh. Truly, my comrades, Balthazar said, love is the greatest of all. Now I understand, said Gaspard, how the weak things of the world can confound the mighty. And I, added Melchior, see what it means for God to come to earth in the form of a little child. And so they turned away, and the radiance of the star was round about them, and they were saying to each other, our search at last is ended. And here is where I end my tale for today. But I'll be back with more stories, many more stories. Thanks for joining me today as we explore stories from around the world. If you enjoyed this story, please give us a thumbs up, comment, and subscribe. For more stories like this one, check out our book, Crazy About Christmas. Till then, enjoy everything this season has to offer. See you soon.